All right, hello. So today is October 31st, 2018. This is the Kubernetes SIG Cloud Provider biweekly meeting. So I'm just gonna link the agenda in the chat. If you're attending, it would be great if you can add your name there and where you work, just so we have a record of who was involved in today's discussions. And yeah, like if you want to add anything to today's agenda, please feel free to do that, because right now we have like one item, so we'll probably end early if there's nothing else. So let's start with introductions. So I'm seeing a few new names. So if you're new and you want to kind of just introduce yourself, say your name, where you work, whatever, that would be a great time to do that.
I'm not new, but I am Justin and I work at Google.
I'm Andrew, I work at DigitalOcean.
I'm Mike, pardon the obnoxious camera angle, I work at Amazon.
Cool, all right.
Hello.
There's no...
Hi. We're both interns on the AWS EKS team. I'm Karina and this is Kirsten.
Hey, welcome.
I'm Jaco, I work at Google.
Walter, Google.
I'm Federico, I work at Google. Got one more off camera there.
Hi, I'm Han. I also work at Google.
I'm Aaron of SIG Beard. I work at Google.
Oh yeah, I should have said Stig Beard. I forgot that.
Cool. If there's no one else, I guess we can get started. So the one item...
It's Steve Wong of VMware.
Hey, Steve. Cool. So the only agenda item I added was to have the discussion around providers as subprojects of SIG Cloud Provider. So when we kicked off the SIG, we had kind of set a long-term goal to consolidate all the provider SIGs into SIG Cloud Provider as subprojects. And so we didn't have kind of full consensus on what that would look like. We just said that we're gonna kind of aim to get that done. And so I figured it's been a few months now that we've kind of kicked this SIG off. And so figured we should have some sort of discussion around what this would look like. And I know some SIGs have already agreed to kind of fall under that model of being a subproject. And I know some SIGs are still undecided. So I think having that discussion now would be great. So from what I understand, what that would look like if we were to do it today would be that we would just kind of follow that subproject model where we just add it under the SIG, and then we have, ideally we have like an owner's file for each subproject. But there's discussions to be had around if the subproject model kind of is flexible enough to do kind of like the providers as subprojects that we want to do going forward. Anyone have thoughts on what this should look like?
I mean, this is something I'm super interested in seeing with my steering committee hat on, because it would mean there are fewer charters for us to review. I know SIG OpenStack is specifically holding off on writing their charter because they'd love to just become a sub-project of SIG Cloud Provider. I think one question might be for a SIG like GCP, who has a number of sub-projects beyond just the GCP Cloud Provider, whether it makes sense to fold all of those additional sub-projects under SIG Cloud Provider, or whether or not this is purely the Cloud Provider thing. So there are a number of other cloud-based SIGs, I think, that run into the same problem. I'm curious what other people's thoughts are on that.
Justin, you had your hand up.
It was just gonna be that point of clarification, whether we're talking about all the sub-projects of what are today the various cloud SIGs, or whether we're just talking about one of them, and essentially whether like the others, the per cloud SIGs continue to exist or not, I guess.
Steven, do you want to say something?
Yeah, speaking on behalf of VMware, we do have the VMware cloud provider for running on top of vSphere, but we've got other things going on with Cluster API or software-defined networking stack. So the portion that relates to cloud provider, I think, would fit well in that model, but I think that there might still be a basis for a SIG independent of cloud provider focused on VMware infrastructure.
So the prevailing like pushback to this would be the it sounds like y'all are using SIGs as user community, and you are free and welcome to do that as yourselves as a vendor. So like Amazon could have their own Kubernetes user community, VMware could have their Kubernetes user community. The question is like, what does being a SIG provide you above and beyond that level of support? Because a lot of the features you're talking about would presumably be features that would be enabled by way of the cloud provider code, right? Like if you have some super advanced networking or some crazy awesome storage, presumably your cloud provider project is the thing that's going to turn that on.
I think
there's some confusion around the organization of the structure overall. And initially, the SIGs were a subset of the overall Kubernetes project. And I think we've hit an inflection point where we get into extensions of or implementations of swappable pieces, and whether that is still within the SIG framework or not has never been clearly laid out for the long term. So I think the user forum is one aspect. The other is implementations of interfaces, for example. And I think there is still, I've heard some feedback that there's some out associated with being a SIG lead, and you get to be part of the SIG leads list, and you get invitations to give deep dives and intros at KubeCon, and there are some benefits. So I wonder if we can figure out what those benefits are and create a new mechanism for certified providers of Kubernetes and work with the CNCF to meet those needs, then maybe the SIG, not SIG question becomes less challenging.
Yeah, even going back to your comment of, you use the example of the networking integrating in with a cloud provider. In VMware's case, our software-defined networking also supports OpenStack. So this is really not, even though it certainly is supported on the VMware cloud provider, it's supported on other cloud providers. So it isn't a Venn diagram where these circles potentially overlap 100%.
That actually may not be the case if all the cloud providers were folded into, say, cloud provider, right?
Yeah, perhaps that's true. Yeah.
From my standpoint, I would love to see SIG cloud provider be the big circle around the needs, the technological programs that specifically relate to running Kubernetes on top of an infrastructure provider, and for managing the concerns, questions of the associated user groups. I see that this SIG should be the beginning of that, because where we've gone, having SIG GCP, SIG AWS, SIG VMware, SIG IBM Cloud, SIG Azure, I think is just too much fragmentation, too confusing for the community. It adds a bunch of overhead, like Aaron was mentioning, in terms of charter review, that does not seem to add much value to the project itself. None of this is about how to make running Kubernetes on top of an individual cloud provider better. Frankly, I would like to see that experience moves and kind of locks up across providers. I don't want to see that the experience is much, much, much better while wearing my open source hat on GCP versus Azure or versus AWS or versus VMware or OpenStack. And I feel like if there's any group that's going to make sure that is true, that it has to be this group. And that having a bunch of providers, you can look at the documentation for the individual providers. I think Nishi has brought this up. and has tried to make the situation better with the documentation cap, that allowing individual vendors to be the sole arbiters of what platform support means on their provider means that users who nominally we're all here to support have a very inconsistent experience across providers, which does not seem to be good for the users or for the project. And I would like to start, roping in that sprawl with this group here. Now, certainly AWS being, I know off the top of my head, they have projects that they have sponsors that maybe don't, like we were suggesting for VMware, there are tooling that helps like certificate management on AWS. Now, whether that should be sponsored by SIG cloud provider, I would argue that yes, it should be, because it's needed and used by the Kubernetes users who are running on AWS. And I think that there's no reason why, this group wouldn't be approving those sub-projects. I see largely that the role here would be more or less just rubber stamping them, assuming that the cloud providers, that the individual sub-projects, are doing the minimum level of due diligence to ensure that the docs are up to date, that, we're making forward technical progress. But I don't want to see the case where that, all these decisions about what is a sponsored project or not have to bubble up to SIG architecture, because each individual provider's SIG is making the case that they should be able to sponsor whatever projects that, they want. I think that you need to be able to bring a little bit more, rigor to that. I think this body should be the body that does so.
So first, Steve, and then I'd love to say something. Thanks, Caleb.
Okay, I just want to make the comment that optimizing or making the decision to save reviews of some certain charters seems like the wrong evaluation mechanism here. I mean, if what we've got now is dysfunctional for getting development activities organized and done, that's bad and we should fix it. But charter reviews, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but even if there were still working groups, aren't there charters associated with that? And review of a charter is an intermittent one-time thing.
Forget about charters for a second. It's about SIG sprawl of the project as a whole. It's about that there are like 30 plus different groups that are called SIGs. And as an end user, contributor, or developer, it might be really confusing to know where to start. Sorry for interrupting, but I feel like the point that charter review is just an example, but consider
okay, I got it.
Things across the project.
But even then, if it just changed to working groups, it still in effect is sprawl. I mean, maybe this is just an artifact of Kubernetes is just getting really big, and we need to maybe consider all ideas about how to manage something this big.
That's a good point. I did want to respond to something that Caleb said about responsibilities and figuring out who is responsible for the consistent experience for the end user across providers. And I want to be careful not to try to take over some of the responsibility that the community has put in the conformance working group and program and process. That is essentially what we have that can guarantee the portability of workloads and the consistent user experience. However, I think there is responsibility for this group in what is the shared code that we can centralize so that we avoid the fragmentation that would bubble up in the conformance suite. And how can we, there was a thread about the shared tests that came up and who would own those tests. I think I didn't respond to the thread, but I think this is a good topic, and I put it on the agenda to talk about next about how this group can own those tests. And so there is a distinction between how to formulate what is required of a Kubernetes implementation and what the implementation details on those providers are. And I want to make sure we separate those and we don't end up testing the implementations. We test the API, and that is what is portable. So Walter had his hand up, and then Caleb.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to mention, it may all be sprawl, but I think any large organization, the way you deal with sprawl is hierarchy. And I think this is sort of what we're looking at is how do we minimize the span out factor at each level. So it'd be nice to start in one place, find a small list of things where you can work out, anything to do with any cloud provider will be under SIG cloud provider. So I can go there, and then I can get the next branch out factor, and I can see, here's the 30 cloud providers. Well, I know the thing I want is under OpenStack, so I'll go to OpenStack. Okay, now under OpenStack, here's the 7 different projects that OpenStack is funding. And that way, instead of starting with a list of 400 and having no idea how to find what I'm looking for, I have a short list of things, and at each step, I knew where to go. If we can find that sort of correct hierarchy.
So
Yeah, and I definitely I want to, one, echo what you're saying, and Walter, that yes, I think this SIG has an important role in pushing down the concerns for, I have a problem with Kubernetes running on provider, from that I need to now hit the top level of the Kubernetes project, which nominally is SIG architecture, to having a one place where you can begin getting that triage. But also to separate I do think, yes, Diego, it's important to separate the idea of conformance from what is the distribution of things you need to run workloads on top of a provider. I think, that this group has the role of sponsoring things like I was saying about the AWS, like the AWS ALB ingress controller, or the it's another good example, the IAM authenticator. These are both parts you need that are beyond just the core of Kubernetes. You can't run reasonable workloads without them. I think this group needs to have some responsibility and interaction over these additional batteries that are beyond this just conformance. So even, with conformance as a strong minimum, this is what Kubernetes is, you still have all of these other additional stuff. And I think that this group needs to be, have some handle on all that additional stuff.
So if we just add a pointer, a field to SIG, that could be the parent SIG, and maybe it's empty at the root, are we done? If we have hierarchical SIGs, are we done?
So I had suggested in one of the PRs by Stephen, and I said that like a sub-SIG structure where there's like top level owners of many sub projects belonging to another SIG can pretty much accomplish what we need.
So it's not we just hit the inflection point where it's a graph now, and we need to embrace that. And
I don't think that is necessary personally. I also am concerned about tinkering with the overall project governance to solve what seems to be a fairly well-scoped problem around cloud providers specifically.
okay,
Like
storage doesn't have this issue there's the CSI, and then there are a bunch of vendors. They don't each have their own SIGs. Is that
right?
So one concern that Nishi brought up, I don't think she's here, so I don't want to say anything incorrectly, but if I was understanding her correctly, one problem is that taking AWS as an example, that the chairs of SIG AWS have influence and ability to change some of the sub-projects that they own, but they may not be in the owner's file of those sub-projects. And so the concern is that if we just kind of put everything as sub-projects under SIG Cloud Provider, then we have to have like a good way to define owners so that like the previous chairs of SIG AWS can still have influence on those projects without having to have their names exactly into every single owner's file for those projects.
Yep, totally agree. I think that's totally part of, one, the good governance for this SIG specifically, but also any transition plan to fold a existing SIG into a sub-project here. I think those are required problems that we need to solve anyway.
And I think the steering committee would be willing to get creative if there is concern around blockage when it comes to the creation of sub-projects. I know that the template that we've asked everybody to use only has 2 options. 1, tech leads choose. 2, every sub-project owner votes and it's a majority decision. I know I have heard concerns expressed that voting wouldn't really work well here, because like what would happen if Amazon wanted to create the ALB ingress controller and Microsoft and Google and VMware decided to gang up and vote no to stop them from doing that, right? That's wholly unrealistic, but I think it's more about empowering people to actually move forward while simplifying the structure and scope of the project is ultimately our goal here.
I mean, I think that same problem could happen with like the leads, right? It could be that two leads become obstructionist and like it gets bubbled up to SIG architecture. So I don't really think that would actually be a problem in practice, but I would like to know, I think Caleb, you mentioned about things going up to SIG architecture. I don't know what that's referring to. Like today, things have bubbled up to SIG architecture.
There's no current incident, but that is the only resolution mechanism that would be available today. Right?
But that would still be the case in the new world, right? That there's only one. That is the escalation path.
You would have SIG Cloud Provider as the first arbiter of disagreement between AWS the vendor and Google the vendor. Hopefully,
so consider totally a hypothetical world where we have some kind of certified cloud compatible Kubernetes conformance thing, right? Where we say if when this particular distribution of Kubernetes works really well with this cloud's network, storage, load balancer, and auto-scaling facilities. And there are a set of conformance tests that verify that in a way that is cloud provider agnostic. Would it be up to this particular SIG to define like what that profile looks like? What is a cloud conformant Kubernetes, or is that the sort of question that would get punted over to SIG architecture? Because I feel like decisions that get punted over to SIG architecture are like, is this in the spirit of Kubernetes or not? And I view this group as trying to answer, is this in the spirit of making Kubernetes interoperate with the cloud more easily? Does that help or muddy the water?
It does help, and I think I agree with your characterization of the focus and scope of the SIG, of this SIG. I'm not sure it helps on whether we hold all provider-specific SIGs under SIG Cloud Provider, and it sounds like the one sticking point is this hierarchy and owners resolution, and not having to manually update owners files for specific sub-projects.
Well, yeah, and I think that concern maybe might be overblown. Like it's my understanding that sub-projects are supposed to map to one or n repositories. So like the repository owner shouldn't change, that they ideally would all map to the AWS sub-project under SIG Cloud Provider, and the owners for that sub-project, unless someone has other criteria or other plan, would just have to become the existing SIG chairs as the initial set of people who are the owners for that sub-project.
Maybe we just take another pass at a proposed end state, and maybe there's concern where there's really no risk.
Yeah.
Just move forward.
I'd rather not the hierarchy of SIGs folding into other SIGs. Like anything we can do to make this beast less gnarled than it already is would be helpful. Part of me, I guess I hope that if we were to move to like every single sub-project that belongs to the existing cloud SIGs just becomes a sub-project of cloud provider, and maybe some people decide it's much easier to batch a whole bunch of repos under one sub-project. Maybe that works well for them. The example I would use is how SIG storage has like one massive Kubernetes CSI subproject, which encompasses like 20 or 30 CSI related repos at this point. So everybody who cares about CSI related stuff works on, like, has decision power for all those repos. And then the decision process just doesn't become like, are we talking about creating a brand new subproject? Does it fall within the scope of this subproject? Because I feel like ultimately it's going to be this group's responsibility to decide if some piece of code is a community supported, sponsored piece of code, or whether it's something that should be vendor specific, right? I feel like that's kind of the delineation that a cloud provider needs to be making when it comes to sub-project creation. Does it
And
belong?
be really clear, the risk is real. The risk of fragmentation is real, and there's a real responsibility to avoid that. So we need to be really careful and set up an organizational structure that supports the goal of interoperability and portability of workloads and consistency for end users.
And I think also we should, one of the things I think works well, at least in SIG AWS, I'm less familiar with the other SIGs, is the user group aspect. And fair enough, a SIG probably shouldn't be a user group. So we would probably want to set up some form of user group type thing so that the people, like SIGs tend to be more engineer, developer type focused groups. And I think it would be good to smoothly transition the people in SIG AWS that are going to it as a user group into a different new structure, like a user UG AWS. You heard it here first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm unclear because I have thus far, when I've reviewed SIG charters, like Stephen, VMware's charter was great. And I thought it's an example I point to over and over again about how like your SIG is the forum for discussion around best practices on using Kubernetes on your specific cloud. That's something that I wouldn't necessarily want this community to feel like they have lost as part of this transition. But I do feel like fewer things would simplify things somehow.
Steven?
Yeah, I think these SIGs are developer focused, but really the developers can get a boost from, let's just say, well-educated and informed users coming to the table, bringing their issues and kind of serving as product managers and giving them a venue to come to the table for that, I think is valuable. So far, at least in the VMware SIG, it hasn't been a big issue where we've gotten big crowds of users taking over the agenda to the point where we don't have focused development and architecture discussions.
And I also echo that, like, it's been great to have that class of, like, group of that type of person come into SIG AWS. And I have also learned a ton from that in terms of sort of real world scenarios. I do worry that is something we would lose if we went to SIG Cloud Provider, which would then be sort of, or like folded them all into one group, because first of all, there would be more people from bigger clouds than there would be from smaller clouds, but also the agenda would just be more diverse, and therefore the sort of signal to noise ratio for someone that only cares about AWS would be lower. So UGs forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think but I think there's two. I agree with what Justin just said, but I think there's a distinguishing. We may want to break them out into UGs or whatever and have meetings for each of the different cloud providers. But that doesn't mean that it isn't actually part of the greater cloud provider. And in fact, I think it would make a lot of sense for someone who wanted to find the right UG, damn you, Justin, to go to the cloud provider page and then find links for who are the people they need to contact, when are the meeting times, etc.
Right. I don't think there's anything stopping this SIG from having multiple meetings, like per provider.
And
I think just the SIG questions about how does this group of folks get access to Kubernetes community resources? So there's a bunch of shared resources, Zoom account, going to create mailing lists or repositories. I don't think the space for users to congregate, to talk, to get information needs to be significantly impacted by where, Stephen necessarily logs in to start the Zoom meeting, or how, he gets his Zoom account to run a Zoom meeting. I think these are separable questions. Sorry, Aaron.
Can we open it up to other folks that have not been participating? Is there any other perspectives of people that haven't felt a space to jump in yet? Okay, well, I feel like we don't have representation from all parties who might be affected here, and it seems like maybe the next step is to come up with a proposal for structure and iterate on it. Someone want to volunteer to take a swing at that?
I think we should volunteer the OpenStack.
I can ping Dims and see if it's something he's willing to do. Since he's on the steering committee, we might have a tighter iteration loop, but I make no promises, and he's pretty overtaxed as it is. Is there somebody from this group that he could collaborate with?
You can for sure sign me up.
Okay, I will make sure Dims connects with Caleb. You can put me as the owner of that AI. The last thing I wanted to say before I apologize for starting to interrupt you, Caleb, was that like subprojects can have meetings and agendas and things on the calendar and stuff. Like that's totally what one of their purposes. So again, if you wanted to have like a sub-project for every cloud, then that sub-project could totally have multiple meetings if you want. One for all about how people are using Kubernetes on AWS today, and then another meeting for the people who are really interested in hacking on AWS ALB ingress controller. Sorry, that's the repo that's just at the top of my screen right now. So like let 1,000 sub-projects bloom. I know it's weird how I'm saying like I'm against having all of these things in a flat space at the SIG level, but I seem to be okay with this at a sub-project level. But I feel like once you enter into the cloud provider space, it's maybe a little bit clear, you know, what you're looking for. When you first come to Kubernetes as a project, like Walter was saying, hierarchy can really help sort of simplify at least the first step in your journey. So I've said more than enough here, I think.
Good.
In information hiding being the good thing that we all like try to do when we're writing software, not information hiding as we're trying to sell you a bridge. So like trying to make the internal structure of the project easier to grok by new contributors.
Great.
Cool. All right, let's move on. So Mike, adding AWS contributors as reviewers and approvers to cloud provider.
Yeah, I proposed two pull requests to add some people from my team, including myself, to the AWS cloud provider. Just we're trying to kind of take a little bit deeper ownership of that, make sure that we're moving that forward, cleaning up some bugs. I know it's a little bit out of cycle since a lot of us are fairly new contributors, so I just wanted to bring it up to the group. So I guess the open question is that okay? Are those pull requests good to merge, or do we need to kind of talk about that a little bit more?
Do you have the PRs? Oh, I see. The PRs are linked.
Yeah.
The de facto thing I have heard is if you're talking about adding reviewers, great. If you're talking about adding approvers, we need to have a longer discussion.
Okay, let's have that discussion then, because I guess I'm conflating the two. I am adding reviewers and approvers.
Okay, so according to the community membership requirements that are spelled out on Kubernetes community, people can't be promoted to approver status until they've been a reviewer for 3 months.
Right.
The idea here. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought we had sort of softened that a little bit.
I have not seen that softened for approvers. Of course, maybe I haven't been paying the strictest of attention, and it is something I have asked if we want to soften, because I have run into somebody who's really active on KubeADM right now, like extraordinarily active, who's not yet an approver. And I kind of would have no problems with them being an approver, but they're still concerned that short of a window, like shortening the window beyond 3 months might lead to the potential for abuse. I don't have a creative enough imagination to draw that line out. But there is concern that you want to make sure you sort of grow your contributor base in a measured fashion. So I'd have no problem with people being reviewers. Moving them straight to having like final say is a little trickier, and I wish I could give you a firm, hard answer on like who's the final owner of that decision as well. Maybe SIG architecture would be a good place to ask that question.
Yeah, I guess the difference here from something like KubeADM is the scope is very narrowly just AWS cloud provider and not a more broad kind of role.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I just wanted to echo the balance is that while it is narrowly focused on a single cloud provider, there are lots of people who run Kubernetes on AWS or GCE or Azure who don't necessarily interact with the provider. Or you could be a company like Heptio that provides solutions on top of arbitrary cloud providers. So balancing like the ability to make changes there, I think, is important. I do think though that our guidelines in terms of reviewers and approvers should have been when you can demand the right to be a approver, and we should be able to use our judgment more locally to promote people ahead of where you are guaranteed to be able to migrate. That was my 2 cents on that.
So my 2 cents, ignoring, the various like abuse, et cetera, I think there's just generally something to be said for the approvers right now have been reviewers for a while, and they probably understand a lot of things knowing our code base that are less than obvious to someone who's just gotten started, whether it's, API machinery or, the GCE or AWS cloud provider code. And I think that even if it feels a little uncomfortable, like just sitting there and reviewing and with someone else for 3 months is going to teach you a lot about the sort of common mistakes that are non-obvious and need to be caught. And so I think of having sort of an internship as a reviewer before you become an approver is generally just good for the code health.
And I feel like that's largely the answer you're going to hear at SIG architecture. I'm interested in being pragmatic, but I'm not the arbiter of the final decision. I think more people who have more seniority and could learn more lessons on how to appropriately grow and delegate approver authority are going to be at SIG architecture. That's why I feel like it's a fruitful place to have that discussion. I appreciate the fact that the code base is focused, but as Walter said, I do think it interacts with large chunks of the project, and there's a lot you pick up over time. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was speaking before I saw Justin had his hand up too.
So I just want to draw. There is a distinction, I think, between the two. There are two repos in question here. One of which is like KK, and there I would suggest, like, I think that there's some great arguments for why it makes sense to start as a reviewer and ping one of the owners in the approvers, one of the approvers, me if you want to, and we can get that going faster. But there are a lot of gotchas in that code which we've learned through bitter experience. AWS, the AWS cloud provider repo, on the other hand, is not something that end users are by and large running today. So I don't know whether there's a difference there. I think there's also a separate discussion of whether we want to do development there or whether we want to do development in the main tree. And maybe that's tied into your requests here. Because I know that you were talking about like a sort of double implementation strategy, I guess, for the cloud provider, which is different from what's happening on GCP. But I would certainly be much more amenable if we do the double implementation to having you guys do it. Like it's lower risk to have you be an approver on a repo which fewer people are using, right?
Yeah,
and that's a very fair point. To split my requests up, the standalone cloud provider repo, the request is almost entirely to help us expedite the double development there, whereas the in-tree was more to just kind of take a little bit more active maintainership role there and start to push that one forward. I think Walter's got a really great point about the KK kind of taking some time as a reviewer and working with a mentor, I guess, effectively. So I'm convinced, at least on that one. But I would like to maybe, if it's reasonable, push forward the out of tree one just to help us kind of expedite our development process.
I think one of the main goals of this whole effort to extract cloud providers was to enable cloud providers to iterate at an accelerated pace and get more velocity and not wait for the in-tree upstream KK repo to come along for the ride. And I want to make sure that we enable and empower those cloud providers to have that. So I'm strongly supportive of that.
I am too, but I just you're the first case that I'm aware of asking to relax the rules for a different repo. I think it's a necessary conversation. What about all the repos in Kubernetes SIGs? Those aren't even considered part of Kubernetes core, right? Conceivably, I should be holding you to some kind of higher standard because cloud provider AWS is inside of the Kubernetes core org. I don't know. I think we should have that discussion. I think another way that we could compromise and empower you right now is there are a couple people in the walls of Amazon who are approvers in that external repo right now. Conceivably, they can just become rubber stamps if they trust the LGTMs that come from reviewers that the bot should be assigning because you've added people as reviewers. That's sort of the way the growth happens, right?
There's been a little bit of pushback against that too, reasonably so. I mean, we want to kind of all be playing the same game and not just have people here that are happy to sign off on literally anything that comes from an Amazon employee.
Right.
Sure, it's from the reviewers, right? You put the people that you would want to grow and nominate as approvers, and you would put those in the reviewers field, and then they would get automatically assigned by the reviewing system to make sure that they get a first look at it. And then your people with approval power wouldn't approve unless they'd actually noticed that it had come from somebody you're trying to train up to be an approver. So conceivably, you're trying to make it much easier on your approvers, but you're giving your reviewers the time to really do the work. And so that should speed up your review process in general.
And also, I don't think it would be any real pushback if you were to collaborate with someone like Justin, who's external to the walls of Amazon, but listed as an approver. Certainly in other SIGs like SIG Node, we work very closely with Red Hat to ensure that all of our pull requests are moving through the system quickly. And that's something that's an explicit part of our strategy for working in Kubernetes.
Justin is contained by no walls, except so far those of SigBeard. Those are the
only this group seems to be in full support of empowering you. I'm just telling you, I really think this decision needs to come after a thorough discussion at SIG architecture. But definitely want to help you move forward.
Okay.
And I think it's a completely valid ask.
I can add that to the agenda for SIG architecture then. And to answer kind of what you were saying, Caleb, I do want to be cognizant of the fact that we're spending me and my team are spending all day doing AWS development, and everybody here kind of is also doing work and other things. And I don't want to just kind of shovel all of my, I don't want to expect people to kind of do my reviews quickly and burden them with the stuff that I'm spending all my day thinking about as well. So I just want to make sure that we're maintaining a balance and not overwhelming people with just a ton of reviews they have to deal with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I would suggest talking or working with folks from Heptio who work very closely on top of AWS, who are outside the walls but have a very your interests are very well aligned. And certainly, and some of these other projects like the ingress controller or the IAM authenticator, that's some real organic collaboration. And so I would, imagine that to see those kind of ties strengthen over time to help ensure that, you're able to make the changes you want to make at a time that you want to make them.
And you should definitely feel free to email me. It is mostly that I am just overwhelmed with volume of notifications more than I am overwhelmed with actually doing reviews, because I can't even get through the notifications, much less the reviews. But if you send me an email, then you could go in a different bucket.
Yeah, and you have to commute only to your house, so
yeah, it's my commute time is spent doing code reviews. Sure.
Fair enough. Okay.
All right. I'm not sure who added the next agenda item, shared testing strategy.
I think it was me. It was about the email thread about testing, and I read it on my phone in motion, so I don't have the full thing. But I wanted to suggest that when opportunities come up to have ownership of shared test infrastructure, where it doesn't fall into SIG testing, we ought to invest in that. And I'm happy to find some people to help out if there are opportunities to pull test infrastructure together and ensure that we are all using the same test to test the implementations. I think that's one strategy we can employ to avoid the fragmentation that I was talking about before.
Dare I ask like what email thread you're talking about?
I'll find it and follow up. But
okay.
A question about should each cloud provider own their own tests for this feature, which is implemented by each cloud provider. And that to me seems like a setup for, yes, the test demonstrates that the cloud provider code does what the cloud provider engineer intended it to do, but is not doing something that is consistent across the board. So
yeah, and that starts to sound a lot more like cloud conformance or something.
That word came up in some point about conformance tests for cloud providers. Knowing how involved that process was, I would like to see if reasonable common sense can get us to the right path first, and that step if it seems challenging.
I heartily agree.
Sorry if that is offensive to anyone.
Yeah, and I think Nishi was doing some discovery work around like how to create a test suite that is across all cloud providers, and so yeah, it might be good to sync up with her because she already did some work there.
Okay, great.
And if you want to send me the doc, so I've got the doc from Nishi that she wrote up on this.
Oh, okay. I just didn't want it to sail by in the night and have every cloud provider start to write their own tests and not have that conversation. Sounds like it's trending in the right direction. So, yay us.
Cool. All right, so I think that's it for agenda items. Unless anyone else wants to bring anything up last minute.
Just make sure to make your 6-month dental checkup. Halloween is a good reminder. Dental health is important. One of the great advancements in humankind. Let's not fall down.
Thank you.
Great filling there.
Yes. Good point.
All right.
Bye,
everyone.
Happy Halloween.